Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's panel on the responsibilities of business to respect human rights in the context of climate change. My name is Yonca Artimur, and I'm the acting dean at the Leeds School of Business here at CU Boulder. So it is important to acknowledge that industrialization and globalization have contributed to the climate crisis. Business is often blamed for depleting natural resources, emitting greenhouse gases, and as this panel will discuss, contributing to the infringement of human rights around the world. But that narrative is starting to change. Industry leaders are increasingly vocal about how their business can play a role in solving the crisis in a socially just manner. Right? Entrepreneurs are responsible for breakthroughs in clean energy, in limiting emissions and increasing efficiency. Large corporations are making net zero commitments, and many investors are placing greater value on the environment, on environmental, social, and governance factors that they believe are critical for long-term profitability. So at the Leeds School of Business, we have had a strong focus on values-driven leadership for over 20 years. It's integral to our curriculum, to the research of our faculty, to our corporate partnerships, and it can be seen in pretty much everything that we do. Leading the charge is our Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility, CSER, whose mission is to drive business solutions to some of the world's toughest environmental, social, and ethical challenges. CSER, let me just give you a couple of things that CSER does. CSER offers a certificate in social responsibility and ethics to our undergraduate students and career pathways in clean energy and natural and organic products to our MBA students. And we're also working on an ESG pathway for our MBA students. CSER also oversees executive education programs in climate action for business and corporate social responsibility, and supports innovative faculty research related to sustainability. So today's panel will examine examples of good business practices toward fulfilling the responsibility to respect human rights in the context of climate change. The panel will also focus on what affirmative steps businesses can and should take to mitigate climate change and its human rights impacts. So I know we're in for an exciting and wide-ranging session. I am going to turn things over to our moderator, David Wallace Wells. So let me introduce him briefly. David Wallace Wells is a columnist and opinion writer for the New York Times. He's the author of the international bestseller, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, which was named one of the New York Times 100 books of 2019, GQ's Best Books of 2019, The New Yorker's Favorite Books of 2019, and was chosen as one of Time's 100 must-read books of 2019. Wallace Wells previously served as deputy editor of New York Magazine and the Paris Review. He is a former New American National Fellow and is a graduate of Brown University. So please help me welcome David Wallace Wells.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. It's a bit of a funny panel since there are going to be three of us on stage and one or maybe two remotely, depending on if one of the other panelists connects. She's been unable to connect at the moment, but either way, it's going to be an exciting, I hope, wide-ranging, free-flowing conversation, which we take in the full scope of this set of questions. And I'm hoping also that we can integrate a lot of audience questions, especially towards the end. So I've been asked before I even introduce my fellow panelists that as the talk goes on, you are welcome to send questions through the app, and they'll be sent to me so that I can incorporate them into the conversation or build them into the sort of final third, depending on how things go. So with that, sort of bureaucratic bookkeeping out of the way, wanted to introduce the two panelists who will be joining me on stage. The first is Stacey Carter, who is the Chief Legal Officer and Senior Vice President of Business Affairs at Techstars. She oversees the company's environmental, social, and governance program and diversity, equity, and inclusion matters, as well as worldwide legal affairs, including securities and capital investments, contracting, employee relations, general corporate matters, governance, and compliance. Stacey, please come to the stage. And while she's walking over, I'm going to start introducing the second in-person guest, Monty Tarbox, who's the Executive Director for Investments for the National Electric Benefit Fund, which provides pension benefits to International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers members and the electrical industry nationwide. And EBF has over 500,000 participants, more than 9,000 contributing employers, and assets of $18 billion. Tarbox joined NEBF in 2013 and is responsible for the investment program, including asset allocation, investment policy, and oversight of extended investment managers. Monty is already on stage, but give him a round of applause. And our third panelist that I'll be introducing is joining us remotely, and that's Caroline Rees, who's the president and co-founder of SHIFT, a nonprofit organization working with companies, financial institutions, and standard setters to make respect for human rights integral to how business gets done. Rees leads SHIFT's organizational strategy and thought leadership work on key challenges and opportunities in advancing corporate respect for business and human rights. There she is up there. Actually, Caroline, I wanted to start with you. We're here to talk about the connection between human rights, climate change, and business. But before we even get to the business part of it, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you see the connection between those first two issues, how human rights and climate change are interlinked, and how you think, how you'd like to see the world understand those connections.
Yes, absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and sorry to loom over the stage in this slightly strange way, but delighted that technology makes this possible. Yeah, I think if we really go back to the beginning of the idea of what sustainable development was about, right? And we can think back in the 1980s, we had this report prepared called Our Common Future that really defined sustainable development and what that means, and has been the bedrock of so much work since. And in the introduction to that report, Gro Brundtland, who chaired the commission, said a world in which poverty and inequity are endemic will always be prone to ecological and other crises. And I think that really is the heart of what we need to be understanding here, that impacts on people's human rights. What we mean by that is impacts that mean they cannot enjoy basic dignity and equality in the world, have a direct relationship with ecological crises around us. And I think we often in this climate debate look at the ways in which those people, the most vulnerable people in societies, whether in workforces, supply chains, communities, will suffer the greatest effects, negative effects from climate change as water level rises, as water resources are depleted, as heat increases. But we also need to see that inequalities, so people who aren't enjoying their human rights, if we understand that as being integral to inequality, are a brake on our ability to tackle climate change as well. When people are unable to put food on the table, to know how they're going to meet the next emergency payment they have to make, struggling to see how this system, this economic system in which they live, is doing anything to address their concerns. It's very much harder for us to progress the policies at the national and international levels that are needed to tackle climate change, to get popular buy-in to those policies and strategies, but also at the ground level. The smallholder farmer who is being asked to change to different crops or change to different ways of farming is less likely to feel able to do that if he or she doesn't know that those crops or those methods are going to enable them to put food on the table tomorrow. So effects on people's human rights are integrally bound up, not just with the effects of climate change and what we need to do in response to it, but with the very phenomenon of how we actually advance our strategies in the first place.
Thank you. Stacey, I wanted to ask a version of the same question to you, but maybe to invite you to answer it in in a somewhat more personal, less abstract way, which is, you're thinking about these issues from a sort of investor perspective. How did you come to think about climate and human rights as central to the work that you were doing, or how did it grow in importance for you? Tell me, how do you end up on this stage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Techstars, the company that I work for, we're going to invest in about 600 companies this year, about 3,000 companies we've invested in since Techstars started. And I've been at Techstars for about 5 years. We've been a B Corp that entire time. So we've had this idea that our business is not just for profit, and we have a greater stakeholder net positive impact mission. I didn't initially work in that. We had a team at Techstars called the Green Team, which a lot of folks have at their companies, and it was really this grassroots team that was starting to do things maybe that you might consider more around CSR. So just thinking about if our events would be kind of driven in a green way, but along with that, starting to challenge the people making investment decisions to consider investing in more companies that had a sustainability focus. One of the people who was really involved in the Green Team worked for me and was very very moved by climate change, and just kept pushing me and said, hey, Techstars could do a lot more. We're investing in hundreds of companies a year. When companies, and they're at the 5 to 10 person stage, when they're at the 5 to 10 person stage, if they can start thinking about responsibility to the planet, humans, others, they're going to be able to integrate that so much more easily than when they're at the 50 person, 100 person, whenever it is that maybe their investors are forcing them, or the public markets are forcing them, or whatever reason it is. And so that challenge, kind of from a grassroots level, I was getting it from our employees, and so started really thinking about how Techstars could make a difference. Our leadership, we had a leadership change, new CEO, who had actually written about empathy in tech, and how the tech industry really does have a responsibility beyond profitability. And I would say those things kind of met in the middle. Leadership starting to have more of a focus on it, and our employees being more insistent on it. And then I ended up being the person who said, great, I'll take this forward for Techstars. And by that, I mean helping all 300 of our employees to integrate it into their work, including the investments that we make. So that's kind of how it came to be.
And how has that story played out since you started that? I mean, from where I sit, which is outside of the corporate space, but there's just been really remarkable cultural shifts in the broader culture, but also in the corporate world over the last couple of years. A lot of big questions about how real those rhetorical commitments are, and what it means when companies make pledges and promises of one kind or another. But just at the broadest strokes level, it seems to me like so many more people, so many more entrepreneurs, so many more executives are talking the language of climate concern, climate urgency. How is that? How does it look that way to you too? How would you describe that story?
So it's all really new, and by new I mean within the last 2 years. I'll give you 3 concrete examples because I do hear a little bit in your questions concerns about either greenwashing or corporate speak, but without anything to back it up. I'll give you 3 concrete things that we've done that I think show a true, let's call it moving of the needle. One, we've incorporated ESG questions into all of the investment memos that our investors, who are called our managing directors, do. It doesn't necessarily mean we are a generalist investor. We invest in SaaS software companies the same as we invest in companies that are a marketplace for carbon credits. But it does help our investors to be thinking about that. 2, we are now offering training for every single one of our companies that go through program, and that started this year. And so last week, I read through 250 comments from companies that had taken our training. So that is every single one of our companies that chose to take the training, but that's at least 250 of them in the last 6 months, that took our really just an ESG basics training. Here's what it is, here's why you should think about it, here's why you should think about it for doing good business, but also profitability, risk mitigation, things that will make you more profitable. And I would say about 2/3 of the comments were somewhere along the lines of, this is great, I'm glad I could think about this. And then there was another 10 to 20% that I was really happy about. They were like, this was too basic, I know this already, we're doing this at our company, which I thought was really awesome. And that also challenges Techstars to say like, okay, well what are we doing next for those companies that are already ahead of the curve? So whether it's the 201 training or matching them with mentors that are gonna be able to help them with kind of more advanced topics or whatever it is. And then the third thing that we've started doing is making our large events carbon neutral. So we run carbon printing for that event and then buy offset credits. It's a small thing for our events, but we publicize it to our company. So we just ran our All Founder Conference in Oakland a few weeks ago, and we're telling our companies, hey, we ran this event carbon neutral, and here are some ways that we did that. Fingers crossed, we're going to come out with a playbook to let people do that really simply. And I think that is where I can see, real change. It's great for us to run a 300-person event that's carbon neutral. It's even better if we can get 3,000 companies to do that with their own events.
Right, yeah, I mean, maybe we can come back to questions of greenwashing and carbon offsets. I didn't mean to sound critical on that question. I was just, as in the general public, as in our political lives, there are promises that we all make and pledges that we all make that are well-meant, but then are much harder to execute than we actually, we actually thought at the outset and find ourselves falling short. And I think, as much as we often in the climate space worry about true double talk, I think there's also a lot of well-meant, promises that just don't get made. But Monty, I wanted to ask you how you see a lot of these dynamics. You're looking at it from a quite different perspective, managing investments for retirement funds, basically. And I wonder how in that position you've started to think about and tried to integrate some of these values in what you do. But I also wondered if you could talk a little bit about the broader cultural context of your sector and your peers. The last couple of years, I think we've sort of come off a little peak of climate commitment and ESG values to something that feels in some ways a little bit like a backlash to some of those values. How do you see that story playing out? But before we get to that, tell me how you see your own work on these fronts.
Well, David, as you mentioned, my pension fund represents 500,000 construction electricians scattered across the country in almost every zip code. And we're funded by contributions from 9,000 contributing employers, all of whom are electrical contractors. Both our employers and our members have been involved in the electrical industry literally since the days of Thomas Edison. And they built the energy infrastructure in this country. They deliver energy services to everybody in this room and everybody who's listening in. So we've always been deeply and profoundly involved in providing energy, particularly electricity, and channeling it. My leadership, though, knows that there's an profound energy transformation taking place, a transition going on, and we are looking for ways to invest that both get good returns, but also create jobs for our members and our contractors down the line and give us some insight into where those opportunities are going to be. I don't know if that's altruistic or pecuniary or what, but we're very interested in trying to think about where the world's going and make sure that our contractors and our members are positioned to take advantage of that. The reality, though, is that we've got a not insignificant number of members who work today in coal-fired plants and in nuclear plants. And our leadership is committed to saying that, well, we're not going to cut the legs out from underneath either those members or the communities in which they live, because often those communities are exceedingly dependent on taxes or support or revenues that come from those forms of power generation. So we sort of take the approach that we're all for the energy transition, but we don't want to see any of our people left behind. And we've got to figure out how to do that both at the policy level, but also at the investment level. There's a huge opportunity today to plan and manage that energy transition. And it's going to take billions and trillions of dollars, actually. And there's going to be a lot of money to be made along the way, and we're hoping we can figure that out. I won't claim that we've got a handle on that yet, but we're sort of feeling our way along in an iterative process. But to your second point about how my peers think about this, unfortunately, most investors have been trained and inculcated with this notion that all the corporation has to be responsible for is making good profits. In fact, one of our other panelists, Jillian, I know wants to talk about, I believe, what she called the Milton Friedman doctrine, and how corrosive and pernicious that's been in how corporations operate and how investors think about it. The good news, though, is that investors are not at all of one mind, and there's a lot of creative thinking going on in the investment community. We can't exactly tell corporations how to behave or how to operate, but we can nip at their heels, we can create expectations, we can create guidelines, and let them know that our capital, the savings of our members, the deferred savings of our construction electricians are only going to flow to those players who get our values, understand what we need for our communities, and are willing to engage in the issues that we're doing. So, for example, there are investor initiatives coming from the International Labor Organization. They've talked about standards or provisions in what they call a just transition, meaning as this energy transition takes place, how do we make sure that it's fair to working people, fair to their communities, fair to people of color, fair to groups that have been experienced environmental racism and discriminated against. There's a coalition of investors called the ICCR that's even got a statement of commitment to just transition, and notably, even right here in the state of Colorado, Colorado is one of the few states that's laid out a just transition plan. And that has a lot of investment implications and a lot of implications for how companies ought to do business. So there are a lot of good things happening. But the bottom line is, if you'll pardon the pun, I don't want to generalize about corporate America. There are a lot of good people doing the right thing for the right reasons. But by and large, corporate America is going to do what is profitable. And either we make that profitable for them or we prohibit them from doing things that are deleterious and make it unprofitable. But at the end of the day, the transition to a carbon-free world is going to happen only if we find ways to we change the incentives for corporate actors and make it clear to them that they can't continue to engage in business practices that are destroying the environment and hurting everybody else along the way. We've got to work out a system of incentives that if we do that, then they'll do the right thing. But until then, it's going to be hit or miss, and it's going to be a result of some of the good guys, shall we say, trying their darndest to do the right thing in a corporate environment or finance and investment world that's not really that committed to good outcomes when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think worry about globally is in the same way that we think about the possibility of a future in which there's a green transition in a number of the wealthiest countries of the world, but then sort of laggard petrostates and their client states. I worry about that same dynamic evolving in the corporate world where you have a number of good actors who are doing what they do and trying to push the ball forward, and then it's almost in an entirely separate sphere, a bunch of people who are continuing to be operate in ways that are damaging to the climate future, and how to think about integrating those two economies.
David, if I could draw a contrast. On the one hand, you've got big oil that's all about greenwashing. They really don't, in their heart of hearts, want to do anything different. If anything, my impression is they want to pump, refine, and sell as quickly as they can before the rest of society says, no, you can't do that anymore. They're in a race to pump as much out of the ground and burn as much carbon as they can. And for example, today in the New York Times, there was a double-page spread from Saudi Aramco. I should have brought it with me. It had some tagline about how they're trying to do the right thing for the right people. Saudi Aramco is not one of the good guys in this, neither is Exxon or Mobil. On the other hand, you've got the auto industry. They figured it out. They figured out their own self-interest that it was going to become increasingly difficult to run a profitable and growing company building internal combustion engines. And so they've kind of gotten the memo, and as we all know, they're busting their hump trying to figure out ways to bring to us electrical cars that vehicles that we're actually willing to buy. You know, I think they're sort of headed in the right direction. Pace of that is open to debate, and how well they do that is a big argument. But those are kind of the two poles, but both are following the incentives that are given to them by policymakers, by the banking industry and lenders, by Wall Street, by their corporate peers, and by consumers like us who buy their products. And we've really got to think about industry by industry how to change the incentives in a way that point them in the right direction.
So Caroline, is that how you, oh, there's Jillian, hi. Since she's up there now, let me introduce her, and then we can sort of work her into the conversation. Jillian leads Resilience Capital Ventures, LLC, a boutique capital advisory practice specializing in blended finance. She's got a proven track record in attracting investment to underserved markets and designing architectures that facilitate partnerships. Her experience includes staff roles with the International Finance Corporation, equity capital markets at JP Morgan Chase, and mergers and acquisitions with British Telecom. Jillian, I don't know how much of Monty's comments you heard, but among the things he was saying was that corporations are not going to be moving in this direction unless the incentives are really aligned for them. I wonder if you could contextualize that a little bit with some historical perspective. I know that you've thought a lot about the way in which our economic paradigms have shaped our sense of choice, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we got to a place where companies and investors feel like doing good, they'll only do good if it adds to their bottom line as well.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be with you on this panel. I only wish that I could have been in Boulder with you. So let me back up a bit, though, before I get into the specific question that you've asked. And it is connected to the history of narratives, but I think it's also connected to whether our mindsets see business as part of society or separate from society. Because in a lot of the conversations about how do we motivate businesses, we tend to view corporations as being separate from society. And that is a very specific choice that comes out of a very particular kind of culture. And that culture, goes back centuries. And so with the origination of corporations as separate legal entities, then it was possible to sort of think of this interest group that is separate from human society. And why that is so important, particularly now, is because, let's say, global GDP, the estimates are about $85 trillion US. But financial assets, the estimates are about $400 to $500 trillion. So we have corporations and financial assets that are actually several times larger than the real economy. And then if you add to that there are 10 men in advanced economies that have more financial wealth than 350 million people, then you have a situation where wealth and economic activity is so concentrated that most of the people in the world and their governments that represent them actually feel quite powerless. So this panel that speaks about locating business within human rights first has to tackle that we have an economic system in which the rights and the power of a few are very, very skewed. And so as we think about how do we change narratives and mindsets, first we have to tackle that many people don't think that they can. And they don't think that they can because of that concentration of economic power. So Monte set me up nicely to talk about Milton Friedman, but Milton Friedman is sort of the most well-known voice of a particular kind of mindset, a narrative that sees business as only being interested in profit, and a very narrow definition of profit, not even long-term profit. And why that matters in a climate change conversation is because the actions that we need to take as a human civilization across the world may not be profitable in a narrow sense in the short term. But if we don't take those actions, then human civilization itself is threatened. And if you're thinking, as I do, from an investment point of view, there are also opportunities to both mitigate the damage that has already been done and to adapt to the damage that is currently killing people in many countries around the world, as well as affecting livelihoods. And so I think that from a global point of view, and I think my colleagues all made very important points about the ways in which investors can have a voice, the ways in which this affects the startup ecosystem, and perhaps the ways in which we can redefine a culture of solidarity across advanced countries and the developing world is what we would need to do in order for business defined as, you know, corporations, private enterprise, to be part of the solution, because I think there are aspects of what private corporations do that is going to be very necessary for us to respond to the climate emergencies and the ways in which the damage that we've done as a human civilization to the planet affects other kinds of activities and phenomena like human health, and even the sense of mental health in terms of well-being, and the sense of whether we can come together as 8 billion humans on the planet and solve problems together. So I think that I'm very hopeful. I'm a relentless optimist. And I'm hopeful because I think that if we are able to mobilize all forms of capital, financial capital only being one of them, and come together where we strengthen financial and business ecosystems, that these problems are solvable, but they're not solvable with the same tools that we have been using and the same mindsets that we have been using. So thank you so much for that question and the opportunity to join the conversation.
Yeah, no, of course. It's all the obstacles and challenges that you outlined are really important and weigh on my mind quite a lot. I mean, I think many people in places like the U.S. and Europe think about the climate challenge in terms of their own lives, communities, and local economies, and have a much harder time understanding the differential ways the changes are impacting people elsewhere in the world. Even already, there are quite prominent studies showing things like a quarter of all global inequality as the result of climate changes just over the last few decades, and that those impacts may, the disparities may increase in the decades to come, which means we may end up with climate change making many of these challenges, obstacles worse, disempowering those who we can least afford to disempower further. But Gillian, just as a sort of a follow-up, you called yourself a relentless optimist. I'm curious if you could walk us through in a little more detail how you see that mindset shift and mobilization of capital playing out. What is the optimistic story that you see unfolding, and what are the sort of benchmarks or touchstones along that journey that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Sure, thanks a lot for that question as well. So Resilience Capital Ventures is a really small company, but in the last 4 years, and we're also quite young, we've been able to help one of our clients that is a European private equity firm mobilize some $130 million in parts of the world that are usually under resourced with respect to financial capital. And this is the Caribbean and Central America. And one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about is that by mounting a blended capital structure, we were able to bring in non-traditional financial sources of capital, a credit union, a teacher's credit union, into a private equity structure. And that gives me a lot of hope, because it means that what I refer to as trapped capital, so this is financial capital sitting in things like pension funds that are trapped in investments that are not necessarily very focused on the climate response. And because we've been able to do it, and so there are some 10 to 15 wind projects, solar projects, as well as energy efficiency projects in the Caribbean and Central America as a result of a visionary, smallish European private equity fund being able to use the best of blended finance structures to actually tackle those problems. I think my optimism also comes from seeing leaders like Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, Philip Davis from the Bahamas, where we have a mandate to help the Bahamas with nature-based financing, because the Bahamas sits with acreages of seagrass meadows, which is a natural form of carbon sequestration. And we believe that we can actually bring those assets to global financial markets in ways that benefit the local communities, as well as do a great job of both mitigation and adaptation of the ravages of climate change in ways that center parts of the world where emissions was not the problem. You know, the small island states in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and countries in Africa. I spent a long part of my career working out of Southern Africa. You know, the contribution to emissions is very low, but the effects are damaging. You know, we had people dying in Durban, we've seen floods in Lagos. And so what we really need to make sure of is that we can have a situation where we build local ecosystems so that there can be the mobilization of finance and knowledge capital in places that are currently not being tapped. And so that's a big part of what gives me that optimism, because I'm putting to work the financial skills that I would have gained in infrastructure financing and telecoms financing and so on, and mergers and acquisitions, to the solving of these very real problems.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the historical injustices here, that, you know, it's the wealthiest countries of the world who are largely responsible for this problem, and it's the poorest countries in the world who are largely bearing the brunt of the impacts. That's, you know, just to put some numbers on those themes. You know, all of sub-Saharan Africa, it's been estimated, is responsible for something like 1% of all historical carbon emissions, just 1%. Pakistan, which, you know, recently suffered through incredible monsoon flooding that pushed 30 million out of their homes, and according to some estimates, may have left as much as a third of the country underwater for weeks at a time. This is a country that in its entire history has produced only as many carbon emissions as the US produces every single year. And, you know, the US is so far ahead of everybody else, including China, in terms of historical emissions, that nobody else is ever going to catch up with us, which means on a national basis, the US is, you know, really the prime villain here. But I think some of the other things that you mentioned are also really important and encouraging too, which is to say, it seems to me, watching the evolution of the climate discourse at the international level, that we're seeing more and more voices from those countries play a more and more prominent role. Mia Mottley maybe most exceptionally, but Mohammed Nasheed from the Maldives, and a number of other leaders of vulnerable countries playing a bigger and bigger role. And at the recent climate conference, for the first time, there was the commitment to what's called a loss and damage facility, which will allow, depending on how it's set up, rich countries in the world to help pay for some of the damage in the most vulnerable places. Caroline, I wanted to ask how you see that story of stories evolving. Am I right to see voices from the global south generally, but climate vulnerable places more specifically, playing a more central role in the conversation? Is that how you see it? And even if so, how do we do better there? How do we build a climate discourse that is actually animated primarily by the people whose countries and communities are most at risk and who have most at stake? How do we broaden that conversation to include those people and not just the same sort of technocratic Davosphere leaders who've been the central figures for the last generation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to make it so. And the inclusion of those voices, as you said, at COP27, some strides made there to elevate that narrative, to elevate that imperative of looking at that distribution of harm in a country by country, region by region way. But as you reflect as well, population by population, group by group, right? How do we look within countries, within regions, at which are the populations that are most vulnerable, that are most at risk? And I think this is a really important way where the human rights lens can help us. We do have, as of nearly 12 years ago, an international standard that's increasingly embedded into laws and regulations around the world, as well as industry standards and so forth, that speaks to the responsibility of companies to respect human rights. And if we go to a really rudimentary level of what that standard is saying, it's a standard of conduct. Central to the theme is to say, you need to do something called human rights due diligence, which says, first and foremost, you need to go and understand where are the people most at risk from the effects of your business. That's your operations, but it's also your value chains. How do you go about, and you need to go about understanding their perspectives and lived realities, right? Whether you're talking about the workers in factories in Malaysia making electronics, or populations in South Asia making clothing, whether you're talking about the effects of platforms like tech platforms online and how they're used in a place like Myanmar in a time of conflict and so forth. You need to be thinking about where are the vulnerable populations. And this language of vulnerability very helpfully spans the climate conversation and the human rights conversation. And it's a really important concept if we're to think about how we bring that voice into the forefront of the solutions that we look to find. We heard from Monty so compellingly about, we've got to listen to the voice of those workers whose jobs are frankly, on the line. They're going to be disappearing, and who we need to think about the reskilling, the upskilling, the alternative opportunities, how we ensure that their families who may already be in economic constraints don't fall further into that. That's part of the mitigation of those transition risks. But I think we've also heard in some of the comments about, I think Gillian talked about adaptation as well, right? In your example, the example in Pakistan, these are countries that are already having to adapt to realities. When a third of your country is underwater, you have to adapt to that. And the populations most vulnerable to the effects of that, of losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, we have to really position the strategies around adaptation to focus on the most vulnerable. And business has a role in that as well, right? As business adapts, we don't want to see business strategies that say, well, look, we can build up the shoreline around this area to protect our plant or our agricultural investment, and it simply displaces the flooding down the coast or along the river to communities that don't have that kind of economic power to just build a barrier that protects us. Thank you very much. You've got to say, how do we holistically engage with those that are affected by this phenomenon and find solutions that work for them too. and equally, as we move into renewables, right? Thinking again about that, it's very easy to sort of think, well, renewables, that's just wholeheartedly a great thing. We're all in on it, which we need to be in so many regards, but not where, for example, the same strategies for siting wind farms are pursued that have been used, for instance, for agricultural development, where local and indigenous communities that are displaced from land without due compensation lose their livelihoods. And that's a well-known phenomenon that's been happening too often in renewables. We need to look at solar energy and the fact that a great deal of the photovoltaic cells are sourced from Xinjiang in China, where we know there's forced labor in these supply chains. So we've got to develop strategies that can say, well, hang on, there are ways to pursue these important strategies that keep our eyes on where the most vulnerable people are, so that as we mitigate risk, as we adapt to new realities, and both need to happen in parallel, we're keeping them in the front and center. And so that means not just talking about the people who are most affected, it means talking with the people who are most affected. And I think leading companies in this space are doing that. And finally, I'll just add, because it's so important, this conversation around the role of investors. And just this week in Barcelona, the group called Principles for Responsible Investment, it's a UN-backed and originated initiative, over 1,200 signatories to responsible business principles, ESG, and over 20 trillion in assets under management between them, have launched an initiative called Advance, which is specifically looking at the human rights aspects of corporate performance, including in relation to climate change. So the first two industries where they're going to be pressing engagement with portfolio companies are metals and mining and renewables, recognizing that we have to be holistic in our approaches, find the strategies that are going to bring the climate and human dimensions together.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about those two sectors for a second, you mentioned that a huge percentage of the solar photovoltaic production is taking place in Xinjiang in China. And just to put a number on that, to really be clear about how dependent we are. At the moment, something like 90% of the production and refinement of solar components takes place in China. It's expected that over the next few years that could grow to 95%. And much of that, as you were just saying, Caroline, takes place under unconscionable labor conditions. So to the extent that many of us in the wealthy parts of the world are excited about the collapse of the prices of solar power, as I am, and what that means about how much faster the transition might come than we thought a few years ago, to a large degree, we are drawing there on really ugly human rights dynamics elsewhere in the world, and we will need to develop new supply chains or new standards to apply to elsewhere in the world if we're going to address the climate crisis without continuing to be complicit in what I think, by most standards would be considered human rights abuses. And the mining issues there are a little bit less pronounced at the moment, but many people raising the alarm very loudly that if we don't set standards sort of ahead of time here, we're going to be in a situation where we're recreating a lot of the sort of quasi-colonial exploitative dynamics around mining for rare earths and precious metals that we're hoping to replace by replacing the fossil fuel business. So there's some real challenges there. Stacey, I wanted to ask you how you operationalize some of these values in talking with particular companies. What are the tools that someone in your position, or more broadly, an outside investor, someone who sits on a board of directors, someone who is working with companies but is not running them themselves, what tools do you have to push those startups in the right direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so in the UN PRI, so we're a signatory, and just following up on what Caroline said, that's actually a topic that they think about quite a lot, because I think the UN PRI is typically thought of with private equity or even traditional VC where maybe you have a board member on the particular companies, and you do tend to have a lot more actual power or control over companies. When you look at let's say angel investors or seed investors or early stage investors, where like we are, where we're investing at a very early stage, less than 10% of the company, and that percentage goes down over time. You're really basing it on, you're really trying to get ideas in early that is persuasive to the founders, and whether it is persuasive to them because of their values or to Monty's point, because of profitability motives. And I think we try to go about it in both ways. This is and we see it really effective. I mean, frankly, we see it more effective when it speaks to people's values. But if we can't get the hook that way, then it's also, okay, well, your investors are gonna ask for it. We are starting to see a lot of diligence questionnaires that ask ESG questions. A lot of times they're fairly rote and people, subject to kind of check the box exercises, but at least we can make the point that investors are asking about this, and you will have more opportunities and be a better investment if you're looking at that. The way I like to think about then kind of offering tools to startups is they're all really individual. And I think actually that's kind of the beauty of ESG is there are so many ways to approach it. So in one of the things I like to talk to startups about, especially at really early stages, is what's gonna be your ESG thing. Sometimes we talk about it as a metric, and a metric can absolutely be appropriate for some companies. Some companies are just way too early. So what's your ESG thing? Are you gonna try to get a person of color on your board, or an ESG advisor that's gonna advise you through these things? Are you gonna commit to tracking your own greenhouse gas emissions? Are you, if you're in the SaaS space, how are you gonna look at things like data privacy or online child protection, like all of those sorts of things? So we give people a menu of, here are 20 things that could be your ESG thing, and encourage them in the trainings that we do and when we talk about them, like, what's gonna be your ESG thing? And once you nail that, can you commit to next year choosing a new ESG thing? So that's kind of how I look at it. I think there are ways and to get more commitment and more in depth. I mean, I think the VC industry is being pushed to say, okay, what's the scope 3 emissions of your entire portfolio? That is a really difficult thing to do, and I think that's a really difficult thing for one particular VC investor to do, especially if you have a really, really broad portfolio like we do with very a small amount of ownership. If industry groups start to decide, if the NVCA gets commitment from its members, hey, we're all gonna insist on this, if all VCs are doing it, or if there's a policy scope, or if it just becomes standard practice, then I think that's something that we can move towards. Which would be great, but we're in a space where the control is more persuasive at this point, I think.
So speaking of persuasion, Monty, you talked earlier a little bit about the need to build, or your hope to build a sort of just transition future. But I wanted to ask whether you get pushback from your clients about initiatives to move the portfolio in a more sort of climate progressive direction, independent of their work. Just like, if you're trying to guide the bouquet, the bundle of investments away from dirty stuff towards clean stuff, is there pushback to that on the profitability question? And if so, how do you answer those criticisms? How do you respond to that?
The simple answer is no pushback. Our members are far too concerned about making their getting enough hours of work so they can make their mortgage payments, make their car payments, put food on the table, and so on. They just want to keep working and have confidence that when it comes time for them to retire, we'll be able to fulfill the pension obligations that have been made to them. Stacy's gave a very detailed explanation of why ESG is far and away the biggest issue in discussion among investors and guiding some of their investment decisions. But I'll be honest with you, as much as I believe in this stuff and as committed as I am to the UNPRI and value the work that they're doing, at the end of the day, ESG and that kind of stuff is just trying to cajole or nag or nudge or plead or beg with corporate entities to go in a better direction, do the right thing. At the end of the day, the power that investors have is to redirect the flow of capital. And we've got to figure out how to do that in a smarter way. The bottom line for me is I've got to have profitable investments. I don't have a choice. I can't just take everything we've got and put it into US Treasuries. Because if we do that, we won't be able to fulfill the promises we've made to working people that they'll have retirement security when the time comes. Like it or not, we have to invest in the growth of the US economy, but we have some room, a little bit of discretion about how to direct capital. Venture capitalists, endowments, public pension funds, multi-employer pension funds like ours, insurance companies can have a profound effect if they say there's just some things we're just not going to finance anymore, and create the expectation that ripples out, including to Wall Street and the banking industry, that we just shouldn't be building more refineries or drilling for more oil, and that even though we all know that we need it in the short run to get us to that great future of renewables where everything works out and is carbon free. But I think we have to face up to the fact that nudging and cajoling and nagging isn't going to get the job done, and we've got to take a much more, here I mean not just as investors, but societally, we have to have the carrot and the stick, but we have to be willing to use both.
So when you're looking at this set of questions, you see there still is a significant trade-off between climate-friendly investment and profitability?
No, I think there are a ton of ways to make adequate profits investing in a whole. We're very excited about the opportunities. It's not just renewables. We're going to have to rebuild the high voltage transmission system in this country and the grid in order to accommodate these intermittent sources of power that typically are located a long, long way from what we call the load centers, the cities where people are needing them. There's not an endless supply, but there are plenty of ways to make money, but you can't expect investors. In fact, my argument is all about you can't sacrifice return in order for these societal goals, as important as they are. You just have to be smarter about how you invest and how to provide incentives to corporate America and to Wall Street to bring us the kind of investments that we want. I was on a panel last month with a guy who's the CIO at the City of London Authority. And when ESG came up, he said, well, that's all well and good. We'll let our investment managers think about that, but that's not really my job. And I turned to him and said, it's investors like us who finance and pay for the CapEx and the construction and the new investments that are going to be made. We're responsible at the end of the day for the built environment in which we operate. Of course it's your job. Of course you've got to think about that. Otherwise, it's too narrow a view, not just of your job, but of the future and how we're going to make money down the track. I think investors have both a moral and a practical responsibility for figuring this out. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but assuming that there's a trade-off, assuming you have to sacrifice return in order to get good climate outcomes, I think is a false dichotomy that's kind of got us in the predicament we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But so given that, when you talk about moving the incentives, how would you like to see that redesigned?
Well, the good news is in the Inflation
Reduction
the IRA,
Act. Yeah.
Inflation Reduction Act,
Yeah.
There's a bunch of great stuff. There are federal tax incentives, there's subsidies, there's preferential regulation for companies doing the right thing and requirements. So there's a bunch of good stuff already happening there. Secondly, we were able to, as a country, we're able to create a massive infrastructure program in the 1950s that everybody in this room uses called the Interstate Highway System. And that was basically the government stepped up and paid for it, said, here's how you do it, you got to do it to good standards. We should be doing the same thing there. Government, or for that matter, investors could provide credit enhancements to the right kind of private investments that go in the right direction. At the end of the day, though, we're going to really have to reprogram the existing public subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry and either redirect that towards better investments or mitigation of all the problems we've heard about for the last 2 days, whether that be a tax or regulation. You know, we've got enough economic activity, we're creating enough wealth to do a lot of what needs to be done, provided that we have a better sense of direction and a better sense of incentives, and we don't leave it to, I think that Jillian will agree with me on this, we can't simply leave it to the discretion of those actors who are making, at the top of the corporate hierarchy, who are making decisions about what they think are in their best interest and most profitable to them.
So I want to ask that actually of each of the panelists. You know, what big things need to change? What are the, you know, either at the policy or the corporate governance level, things that need to be done or should have been done, you know, years ago to get us on track? Maybe Caroline, do you start with you?
Well, I do think that this, I mean, we've got this structural problem. I go back to what Jillian was talking about, right? We've got to move from this shareholder primacy to what's called stakeholder capitalism, but isn't yet in practice a true stakeholder capitalism. So we need to look at governance, and it's not enough for us just to look at boards of directors and say, you should think in these ways and act in these ways, because if their investors are sending directly opposing messages to them and they're at risk of whatever it may be, you know, hostile takeovers and so on and so forth, because they're not pursuing the maximum short-term return, then we need to unpick that at the investor level as well. So I think, picking up a little bit here on Monty's theme, we've got to combine incentives for responsible business practice, and we need there absolutely carrots and sticks as well. In the European Union at the moment, they're developing legislation on human rights due diligence with civil liability likely to be attached where there is contribution to human rights harm. So we need regulation around expectations of how companies go about understanding their impacts on people and taking responsibility where they're contributing to egregious harms. But we also need to really create the right incentives in the investment arena to move away from this short-termism and to really create a different sense of the responsibility when it comes to investing and the ways in which we measure performance as well. And that goes also to the issue of time horizons that was referred to. And we're seeing now changes in the expectations of disclosures that are not simply about quarterly returns, but are asking companies to report with different time horizons. And we need to ensure that conversation there also about investors and so forth. Those who have to take pension funds have to take longer term time horizons. We need those kinds of investors who can and do and must look to the mid and long term to really start to change the paradigm of the pressures on boardrooms so that we don't have conflicting incentives.
And Jillian, what do you think? What are the biggest failures or shortcomings that need to be addressed sort of immediately on this front? How would you, if this were a panel of global governance right here, what would you be coming to the table proposing or hoping to see implemented or achieved?
So first of all, what I would say is that responsible investment is actually what is required to do investment well. A colleague and I say that what has gone, really pear-shaped is that we keep coming up with these three-letter acronyms, ESG and other things, to describe the fundamentals of good investment. Investment is about value creation in the future. And one cannot create value in the future if you're not assessing risks. And the risks include the natural environment, but it also includes doing things like having a good workforce. Because in thinking about things like supply chain management and so on, a workforce that is not well equipped is not well oriented towards new technologies and changing technologies, which has been the story of, in the US, the industrial heartland, not keeping up with new technologies. That is value destroying, not value creating. So we didn't necessarily have to come up with a new thing. We actually needed to do investment well. And we also needed to, picking up on one of the things that Monty said, we also needed to think about whether we were maximizing returns or we were producing adequate returns and reinvesting those returns in the future of the business. Because the story of the last, say, 20 to 30 years of maximizing returns has been a story of share buybacks. It's not a story of increased productivity. It's not a story of innovation. The innovative potential of the United States has actually declined in the last 20 to 30 years. Convenience apps are not particularly innovative. And so we've had tons of financial capital move into public markets without a benefit. So, to go back to your question, what would need to change? What would need to change is we would need to have finance and investment being right-sized for societal benefit. The last 20, 30, 40 years are quite an anomaly in that you have, through financialization, you have a divergence of financial returns and maximizing of those returns completely, almost completely disconnected with the well-being of society. If that changed in terms of what constitutes good business, if that changed in terms of what was rewarded, including on Wall Street, we would have a shift. And of course, regulation is a part of it. And I think I have been using the term recently, we need to go back to good old-fashioned industrial policy. And the Inflation Reduction Act is some of the smartest industrial policy that has been seen around the globe. And of course, if the US is doing industrial policy, then other parts of the world start to think, well, hang on, we don't have to see it as an either or. Either government is intervening or we're using only the market. And so I think, again, those are things that I feel in the last, very recent history, last 2 years or so, in terms of the policy moves that have come out of the Biden-Harris administration, that they're very solid and set us up in the U.S. for some very good outcomes.
So I'd like to pull on a couple threads. Jillian talked about value creation and not value destruction. I think a company where we've seen the biggest example of value destruction recently is with FTX. And Monty said, hey, we need to, investors are going to only think about profits. Well, think about the profits that investors lost with FTX. What we don't hear about in the news is actually principles of ESG could have prevented some of those things. Now, if you believe it's complete fraud, maybe not. But if you think about good governance, conflicts of interest, transparency, just basic compliance that could have gone into that, and maybe you wouldn't have had the high valuation and the massive, quote unquote value creation that there was at the beginning, but you also would not have had the value destruction. So I think it's incumbent on, as we're talking about some of these places where clearly a company or a CEO has failed massively, do we bring that back to ESG and say, ESG is not just, hey, let me go, compost my my cup at the end of this. ESG is making sure we don't lose $8 billion on this one thing because we didn't put the proper things into place. The investors didn't insist on that. The employees didn't insist on that. And this one guy who was controlling it decided, who by the way, knew about those because he had worked at firms where those were certainly in place and decided, no, I'm going to ignore those things.
Right. My contribution would be just 2 points, what I hope I can simplify. First of all, our system, our economic system is predicated on privatizing profits and externalizing or socializing costs. Carolyn gave some good examples of what the Europeans are doing about through, I guess, litigation perhaps or regulation to compel companies to recognize the full costs, the real impacts and the economic costs of their activities. Another example would be either a carbon tax or some kind of oil royalties tax or payment that gets diverted to climate change mitigation. So that's my first point. We really need to think about the externalities that make, for example, big oil so bloody profitable, and we need to address that. Second point I'd want to make, though, is whatever we do, we've got to keep the principles of just transition in mind because of not the economic or even the human rights dimension, but because of the political dimension. Working people around the world have to feel like they're not going to be left behind, they're not going to be taken advantage of, they're not going to be thrown on the scrap heap in order so that they have buy-in and that they back the political initiatives that are needed for this, and so that we don't end up in the situation we've been politically in the United States in the last 5-6 years.
Yeah, I think I saw a paper recently that in some new estimate of social cost of carbon, now there's more economic damage produced from every barrel of oil than there is profit to the oil company that comes out of that barrel of oil.
Right, but they don't have to absorb that
of
cost.
course,
Right,
of course,
that is exactly the problem.
Exactly.
But we've got an economic system that rewards them and basically puts money in their pocket for doing precisely that. So that's what I mean about we've got to look very hard at all the externalities, all the costs that they're shifting, laying off or throwing out on the rest of society, whether it be developing countries, working people in the United States across many dimensions. But everything that the other panelists said are spot on.
So how do we think about the externalities of the transition itself? That is to say, the new mining, the new supply chains, all the things that we think are going to be necessary to bring about the end of fossil fuels. I mean, Jillian, you mentioned the convenience apps. I think one of the ways in which that's a useful reference is how much labor and exploitation is sort of shielded from the user. And we imagine it's just an algorithm that's delivering our groceries as opposed to somebody who's, if they're being adequately paid, they're probably being adequately paid because venture capital is subsidizing it, not because the user is actually using it. And of course, there are huge things that are hidden from us in the current fossil fuel system. We have, depending on what study you want to look at least several million, possibly as many as 10 million people dying every year from the air pollution produced from the burning of fossil fuels. So there's certainly a lot that we're not dealing with when we're thinking about the current system. But when we think about where we're heading, all of the new mining, all of the new industrial production, the places in the world that are likely to be producing that and where they are on the sort of global pecking order and what kinds of standards they can set for themselves and what kind of demands they can make on buyers like the US and the rest of the global north. How can we think about making explicit those externalities, those environmental costs, those human rights risks, and how can we think about building some enforcement mechanism that prevents abuses on those fronts? I don't know who wants to answer that, but if anyone on the panel has thoughts.
I'd love to.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'd love to take up the issue of the just transition and bring in that point, because I think that the just transition is not only about the new materials and so on required, the just transition is also about making sure that standards of living continue to increase. And by standards of living, I don't only mean GDP. I mean standards of human well-being and self-expression and so on. And why that is important is because there is a certain sense in which developing countries are also being asked to give up on particular aspirations in order to make a change in their energy systems. And that's not going to happen. That's not going to, COP27 was a milestone in terms of African governments and African leaders saying very clearly that that was not a choice that is either fair or just, because there are ways to design energy systems that do not make the errors of the past. And so I think that a just transition also needs to be a smarter transition. There's no need to reproduce the carbon intensive lifestyles of the wealthy global north in the rest of the world. But what we do need to be doing is also recognizing, when I first met Monty, I mentioned this, that in one province in South Africa, in Mpumalanga, there are 12 coal-fired power stations. And of course, those coal-fired power stations, in addition to producing energy for the grid, account for a lot of the employment in that province. And so a just transition would also need to think about employment options for those workers and retraining opportunities in the new systems, the new technologies and so on, so that you don't have new technologies and new energy systems being associated in people's minds, the minds of the working class, as being unfair. And I think that there is an opportunity, a strange opportunity for solidarity across the world in terms of workers that might be displaced. And so it's really important that when we're thinking about what transition means, that we take account of different starting points. The transition in Youngstown, Ohio, and the transition in Mpumalanga, and the transition in a small Caribbean island or in the Pacific are going to be very different depending on the industrial character of those locations. And so I think in addition to being just, we really need to be smart and bring in as much of the expertise about technological change, about labor, about innovation, about financing, transitions as we possibly can, and bring all of that together across different types of intervention points as well. And I'm seeing some of that happening in terms of by academics sharing expertise, but I also think that large consulting houses, think tanks, governments, and some of the not-for-profit policy organizations can make a big difference in terms of how we do this and do this well. So thank you for the question, David.
Jillian's right that we have to pay a lot of attention to what the consequences are for working people in their communities. They have to feel like backing good climate change policies makes their lives tangibly better in ways that they can see. If we don't, then the other side is going to capture them. The Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, and so on, they're very good at making the argument that trying to address climate change is going to hurt you and hurt your family. And although we know that's hypocritical and wrong, we need to do a better job of making sure that whatever policy paths or for that matter, investment paths we go down, that average people feel like, yeah, that's going to make my life better, whether it's I can breathe the air in my hometown, or I'm going to have a steady job, or the local schools are still going to have the taxes they need to educate our kids and so on. If we don't get that right, then we're absolutely going to lose the political battle, and heaven help us.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to move mostly to audience questions, but as we've been doing a little bit more in the second half of the panel, it would be great if anybody want to jump in either remotely or on stage whenever you have anything to add to something someone else is saying. One question is about the challenge, the risks of economic growth more generally. So this audience member writes, considering the strong correlation between levels of income, wealth, and carbon emissions and environmental degradation, does the business community recognize that it is a core responsibility to reduce human economic activity? I suspect that no one on this panel will say yes to that question, but I'm curious how you think about the risk of endless growth, not just on climate, but on biodiversity and natural ecosystems and communities. How do we balance the risks coming out of economic activity with the everything that we've seen to this point as being the associated environmental damages?
Well, I get the spirit of the question, and I think it's pretty profound, and it's a different way of coming at what I was talking about before. The example that I would give is we spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about how are we going to create clean electricity and how much we're going to put into renewables and so on. What gets lost in the conversation is, well, what can we do to reduce the demand without requiring us to be cold and shiver in the dark? And there are plenty of ways to do that. Here in Colorado, the Rocky Mountain Institute is world famous for coming up with practical policies to do that. I only offer that as one way to kind of get at the questioner's point about growth. Clearly, growth out of control is going to kill us. But to Jillian's point about thinking of a smarter transition, there's a lot of low-lying fruit on how we can reduce consumption without necessarily reducing quality of life.
And in fact, I think electrifying the American power system would, we lose so much of that power as waste heat in transmission, and electrifying everything will make
That's
things.
true, but they still, at the end of the day, they get paid for selling electricity. So their incentives are to sell more. That's part of the problem we have with the structure of the utility industry in our country. That's just one example.
Does anyone else want to say anything about the relationship of economic growth and environmental damage and whether the business community has a responsibility to reduce rather than promote economic growth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm sure everyone knows that there's a movement, hashtag degrowth, that's very popular in wealthy countries around the world. That really is a very myopic view of what our planet looks like and what life is like for billions of people around the world. For someone to suggest that we can encourage and take active steps to move towards having less means that they are not as sufficiently informed about the conditions under which billions of people provide shelter for themselves, adequate nutrition, clean water, sanitation, roads, agricultural materials to grow food, and education for their children and themselves. Because until those very basic developmental needs are met, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals is one way of measuring that. With all of the fanfare about ESG and ESG reaching $53 trillion, the SDG financing gap is growing. So before COVID, it was about $2.3 trillion a year. After COVID, it's about $4.5 trillion a year because investment funds were diverted to public health. So this is another example of needing to be very careful about differentiating the starting points. In wealthy, advanced countries around the world where there have been excesses, it is perfectly legitimate to speak about accelerating and shifting patterns of growth so that the continuous, harm to the planet and to the natural environment stops. It is not true that that applies all around the world. And it is really important that people in wealthy countries are aware of that, because otherwise we'd be setting ourselves up for conflict as opposed to having more solidarity in terms of how we solve together these planetary crises that we're facing. So I'm afraid I cannot agree with the spirit of the question. And, I'm happy to continue that discussion with the questioner on LinkedIn or what have you, because I think it's a very important sort of education piece in terms of how we actually get a starting point for what do we need to be doing together as a human family to take this forward.
Well, I'm not a degrowther myself, but just in fairness to degrowthers, I think most of them would say that the goal of the movement is to reduce growth in the richest parts of the world in order to enable growth in the global south. Now, whether that's a useful strategy or
that's a problem with hashtags, right? Because the hashtag doesn't say degrowth in parentheses only in rich countries. So that's the problem.
Another question from the audience is about the matter of industrial policy as a form of sort of economic nationalism, and whether or not the kinds of measures that were taken under the IRA, restricting tax credits to EVs manufactured primarily in the US or among friendly nations, will initiate a new cycle of trade wars, maybe most dramatically with China, but even with countries that we consider relatively comfortable trading partners, like I think the question mentioned South Korea, and then countries in Europe who are worrying about the implications of the IRA for existing trade law. Any of you have thoughts about the way that those things may play out?
The questioner is right. If like the IRA is done in a stupid way, in a bad way, but we see, for example, this weekend, France and the United States are trying to kiss and make up for disagreements that they've had. The reality is that globalization not only intertwines our economies, but it probably needs to and has intertwined our monetary systems and our public policy systems. I think that what we've done in the IRA, those kind of encouragement, if you will, to go down the right path, should only be done if we get collaboration and cooperation with other major countries, major economies. My point is simply that we just can't do any of this stuff on a unilateral basis anymore. I don't know a good mechanism, a good multinational mechanism for working that out, but I think that those problems are by no means insurmountable, provided that that the United States just doesn't say, well, we're going to do what's right for us and everybody else can figure it out on their own.
Any other thoughts from anyone on the panel? I mean, I do worry a little bit about, in the medium term at least, about the solar panel numbers. I mean, the world is so dependent on Chinese manufacturing, and I think that may prove an obstacle in the medium term. And when I think about, the numbers aren't quite as dramatic for the inputs to EVs, but, if every piece of your EV has to be manufactured in the US by 2030, or you're not going to get that tax credit, I'm not sure that we have the manufacturing capacity to get us.
Well, we clearly do not, and that's a good example of conflicting or competing priorities. On the one hand, we want to encourage people to have access to affordable EVs, but on the other hand, we want to try to protect American industry. You're exactly right that some of that is in conflict, but I think through an iterative process, we can find our way through that, but we have to recognize that we need to be in dialogue with other countries. I guess I'm not a global trade expert, but I think that was part of what the thinking behind the WTO and certainly around the European Union. We just need to recognize that we need to have those conversations on a global level and develop the forums and the institutions to do that.
Well, it looks like we're out of time, and that's probably a decent space to end about the call for global institutions to manage this transition. So I want to thank all of our panelists and everyone in the audience. It's been a great conversation, and thank you all for coming. Round of applause.